Welcome to a deep dive into the JFK assassination.
Oh, yeah.
You've given us a ton of material about that day in Dallas.
Right.
And it seems like you really want to go deeper than just the surface level stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, this topic, it just has layers and layers of information, speculation analysis, and we're here to help you kind of navigate through all that.
Okay.
And hopefully pull out those insightful nuggets that
Right
someone
on.
who thinks they know everything about JFK might be surprised by.
Exactly. So let's start with just like a look at the day itself.
Sure.
You've given us several firsthand accounts from people who were actually in Dealey Plaza, including some excerpts from the Warren Commission testimonies. And what really jumps out from these accounts is just the chaos immediately after the shots were fired.
Yeah, that chaos. I mean, that becomes really important when you start to look at the specifics of the evidence.
Okay.
Like, for example, you included this really fascinating article by a forensic scientist who analyzed the trajectory of the bullets.
Yeah.
And, he argues that the magic bullet theory that the Warren Commission put forward is just highly improbable based on the physics.
Yeah, that article really grabbed my attention, too, especially when he starts talking about the Zapruder film.
Right.
Like Frame 313.
Yeah, Frame 313.
Right.
That's been like a focal point for debate for decades, showing Kennedy's head snapping back so violently it just, it suggests a shot from the front.
Right.
Which contradicts the Warren Commission.
Completely. And you've also got all this stuff about Lee Harvey Oswald's background.
Yeah.
Like one of the books you shared really digs into his psychological profile and suggests that, he was deeply troubled.
Right.
Maybe seeking notoriety.
Yeah.
It kind of paints a picture of someone who might have been capable of this, but also someone who could have been manipulated.
Easily, yeah. And that's a key point because that idea of Oswald as a patsy that comes up again and again in these materials.
Right.
A lot of your sources present evidence that raises questions about his role.
Okay.
Like, for instance, one article points out all these conflicting eyewitness accounts about where Oswald was.
Yeah.
In the Texas School Book Depository building at the time of the shooting.
It's like, these sources are really encouraging us to kind of look beyond the official narrative and consider, like, what other possibilities could there be?
Right.
One book you included even suggests that Oswald might have been, like, a low-level informant for the FBI.
Interesting.
Which really complicates his role even further.
That's wild. And what's intriguing is that this source is actually written by a former intelligence officer.
Oh, wow.
Who claims that the FBI... they deliberately downplayed Oswald's connections to the agency.
Okay.
To avoid being scrutinized for their own potential failures.
Oh, wow. So like a cover-up, kind of?
Yeah, potential cover-up.
That's a pretty explosive claim. It really makes you think about, like, to what extent was information controlled and manipulated after the assassination?
Absolutely. And that manipulation of information is something that comes up a lot.
Right.
Particularly when it comes to the handling of, like, key evidence.
Yeah.
You included a really insightful article about the chain of custody for the bullets and the rifle.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah. It talks about how there were these inconsistencies and gaps in the official record.
Right.
Which really fueled suspicion that evidence might have been tampered with or even planted.
Right. And then on top of that, you have the whole mystery surrounding the autopsy photos and x-rays.
Oh, yeah.
Like several of your sources talk about those discrepancies between the official reports and what eyewitnesses from the medical staff at Parkland Hospital actually saw.
Yeah, and you specifically highlighted this documentary that features interviews with some of the doctors and nurses who were actually there during Kennedy's treatment.
Yeah.
And they claim that the wounds that they observed just didn't match the descriptions in the official autopsy report.
Right.
Which just adds to that speculation that the photos might have been altered.
It's like every layer we peel back just reveals more questions than answers.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole issue of the missing brain.
Oh, right.
One of your sources, like a book by a prominent JFK researcher, dedicates an entire chapter to the strange disappearance of President Kennedy's brain from the National Archives.
I mean, that missing brain could have provided crucial evidence about the trajectory of that fatal bullet.
Right.
It's a major point of contention for people who question the official narrative.
Of course.
And this author suggests that its disappearance was a deliberate attempt to prevent any independent analysis that might contradict the Warren Commission.
Makes sense.
It's not even just like the physical evidence, that raises questions. Some of your sources like really dig into the people around Oswald, like his wife Marina. One of the biographies you gave us paints like this really complex picture of their relationship. And it kind of suggests that she may have known more than she initially told investigators.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting biography, especially when the author starts analyzing her testimony before the Warren Commission. Like her statements are often contradictory and really emotional,
Yeah.
It suggests maybe fear, loyalty, even guilt.
Yeah, it reminds us that history is made up of these human stories, And those stories, they're rarely straightforward. The people involved in this event were complex. And they had their own agendas, fears, secrets.
Of course.
And that just makes it so much harder to figure out what the truth really is.
Totally. Speaking of complex individuals,
yeah,
you gave us this documentary about Jack Ruby.
Oh, yeah.
The guy who shot Oswald.
Right.
And it really delves into his ties to organized crime.
Yeah.
Which raises the question, like, was he acting on behalf of someone else?
Yeah, that documentary, I mean, they make a pretty compelling case for his mob connections.
Yeah.
They've got interviews with former associates, FBI informants, organized crime experts. And it suggests that Ruby, who owned a nightclub that was popular with mob figures, might have been told to silence Oswald.
Okay.
Keep him from revealing damaging information.
One of the things that really stood out to me in that documentary was this phone call that Ruby made right before shooting Oswald. The filmmakers got these phone records that show him calling a known mobster with ties to Carlos Marcello, who definitely had a reason to want Kennedy gone.
That's a huge connection.
Yeah, and that phone call and what it might mean is just one of many little threads in all this material you've given us. It's like every source adds a new layer and makes us rethink the official story and look for other explanations. And it's not even just the assassination itself. You've also included sources about like the Cold War and Kennedy's policies on Cuba. There's this article by a Cold War historian who argues that Kennedy's actions in the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis really made him some powerful enemies.
He probably made some people who wanted revenge.
Yeah. And it's important because it shows how the JFK assassination is connected to this bigger web of global power struggles.
Absolutely.
And political intrigue.
Yeah, that author's suggesting that Kennedy, in trying to stop communism, made choices that made powerful figures mad, both in and outside the U.S.
And you included this book about how the Kennedy administration tried to dismantle the CIA.
Oh, right after the Bay of Pigs?
Yeah, and the author was a former CIA analyst.
Wow.
And he argues that because Kennedy didn't trust the CIA and wanted to limit its power, he became a target for people inside the intelligence community who felt threatened by his reforms.
So basically he was trying to change things. And some people didn't like that.
Yeah, and that's another layer to the story, right? Like maybe the assassination was an inside job.
Yeah, from within the U.S. government.
Exactly. And the author presents evidence that Kennedy and the CIA were clashing. And that his trying to control the agency created a lot of hostility and resentment.
That's pretty wild that the truth about JFK might not be about some big conspiracy from another country. But about these power struggles and hidden agendas within the U.S. government itself.
Yeah, and that, I think, is one of the biggest things about the JFK assassination. It forces us to confront, like, these uncomfortable realities about power and secrecy and the fact that even the institutions we trust can be corrupt.
Yeah, it reminds us that history is rarely black and white. And the search for truth can take us down some unexpected paths. And reveal things about those in power that are pretty uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And the sources you've given us, with all their different perspectives and the research they've done, they encourage us to really look critically at the past, question what we think we know.
And be open to the possibility that the full story might be more complicated than we thought.
And speaking of complexity, you included these essays that look at how the JFK assassination affected society and culture. One essay by a sociologist argues that it was a turning point for America, that it shattered our innocence and brought in an era of cynicism and distrust.
Yeah, that essay, I mean, it really captures how disillusioned and lost a lot of Americans felt after the assassination. The author's saying that the murder of this young president, who everyone loved, seemingly out of nowhere, it just shook the nation's faith in its leaders and institutions.
It's like the assassination became a symbol of how fragile democracy is.
Right.
Like even the most powerful country in the world is vulnerable to chaos and violence.
That's a really powerful insight.
Yeah.
And it connects to the big themes that come up in your sources.
Okay.
Like the nature of truth, the limits of power, and that basic human need to understand tragedy and loss.
So the JFK assassination, it wasn't just a historical event.
Right.
It was like this cultural touchstone.
Yeah.
That still shapes how we see ourselves and the world.
And the materials you've given us,
yeah,
with their different viewpoints and analyses, they give us this valuable lens to look at this really important moment in American history.
Okay, so we've talked about the evidence, the main players, the historical context, and the impact on society.
Yeah.
But what's really clear in a lot of your sources is that there are still so many unanswered questions.
Oh, absolutely. Despite all the investigations and books and documentaries, we still don't fully understand what happened in Dallas.
Like you gave us this really interesting article that digs into all the inconsistencies and contradictions in the Warren Commission report.
Right.
And the author carefully points out where the commission's findings don't match the evidence or where they just don't answer key questions.
That article really highlights something important. The Warren Commission, despite all its work, didn't really solve the JFK assassination.
Right.
Instead, it left behind all these unanswered questions and discrepancies that people are still debating today.
And all those unanswered questions, as your sources point out, have really fueled all these conspiracy theories.
Absolutely. The JFK assassination. I mean, it's like this breeding ground for alternative narratives, each with its own interpretation of what happened and its own villains and shadowy forces.
One of the books you shared even says that the assassination was part of this much bigger conspiracy.
Wow.
With multiple shooters, government cover-ups, and ties to organized crime.
That book is pretty speculative.
Yeah.
But it's definitely thought-provoking.
Right.
They use all sorts of sources like declassified documents, witness testimonies, forensic analyses. It might not convince everyone, but it shows how the JFK assassination still captures our imagination.
Right.
And makes us question what we think we know about history and power.
It's like the assassination has become this Rorschach test.
Oh, interesting.
For how people see the world.
Yeah.
Some see it as this tragic but random act, while others see this sinister plot that says something about deeper problems in society.
That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
And the sources you've given us, they reflect that some authors debunk conspiracy theories, while others present evidence to support them.
So it reminds us that history isn't just facts.
Right.
It's interpretations, perspectives, and often conflicting stories.
And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Exactly.
The JFK assassination, with all its mysteries, and the way it makes people react so strongly, it challenges us to think critically.
Right.
To really look at the evidence and to be open to the possibility that we might never know the whole truth.
Yeah, and that's maybe the most important lesson we can take away from this deep dive. To be humble when faced with how complex history is. And to be okay with not knowing everything. So it seems like, no matter how much you dig into the JFK assassination, you always end up with more questions than answers.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean like trying to understand it is pointless.
Right.
You actually gave us some stuff about how to think about these mysteries responsibly.
Yeah, a lot of your sources, they really emphasize that we need to separate speculation from actual evidence-based inquiry.
Okay.
They're warning us about getting caught up in these sensational theories that don't have any real support.
Right.
Like there's this one article by a journalist who debunks conspiracy theories for a living.
Okay.
And he gives some really helpful guidelines for how to evaluate information about the assassination.
Yeah, I remember that one. It talked about like looking at who's giving you the information.
Right.
Considering their biases.
Exactly.
And checking their claims against reliable historical sources.
Yeah, he wants people to be skeptical, but also open-minded.
Okay.
To question everything, but to base their conclusions on facts, not just guesses.
That sounds like good advice for looking at any historical event, really.
Absolutely. It's about thinking critically and being able to tell what's real and what's not.
Right, especially now when there's so much information and misinformation out there.
Exactly.
And speaking of all that information,
yeah,
one of the challenges with JFK is that there's just so much stuff.
It's true.
You know, you gave us books, articles, documentaries, even online forum discussions. It can be overwhelming.
It can be, but it also shows how much people are still fascinated by this.
Yeah.
And how much they still want answers.
Right.
What's helpful is that a lot of your sources, even the ones that disagree with each other, they still give us valuable insights into the different ways people think about the assassination.
Yeah, so by looking at all those different viewpoints,
right,
even the ones we don't agree with,
exactly,
we can start to see how complicated this case really is.
And maybe that's the main thing we learned from this deep dive.
Okay.
The JFK assassination with all its mysteries. And the way it makes people debate so passionately. It reminds us that history is rarely simple or clear-cut.
Right.
It's all about interpretations, perspectives, and questions that we might never answer.
It's like we've been given this giant puzzle with some pieces missing, and we have to try to make sense of the pieces we do have.
Right.
Even though we might never have the whole picture.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And the sources you gave us with all their different viewpoints and analyses, they encourage us to look at that puzzle with a critical eye.
Okay.
To be open-minded.
Yeah.
And to accept that there are some things we might never know for sure.
And even if we never figure out exactly who killed JFK and why, just trying to figure it out can be really rewarding.
Absolutely.
It makes us critically question what we believe and have these important conversations about history, power, and the search for truth.
Exactly. The JFK assassination with all its mysteries and how much it affected the world. It challenges us to look at the past, understand the present, and keep fighting for a better future.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the JFK assassination.
Of course.
We hope this has given you some new insights into this really complex and fascinating event.
Yeah.
And maybe even inspired you to keep learning and thinking about it on your own.